textbooks tell us a simple story. Civilizations rose in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley. These were the first cities, the first organized societies, the first stone walls to stand against time. In this accepted version of history, writing, agriculture, and monuments come together in a sudden bloom about 5,000 years ago. Before that, humanity is painted as a scattered collection of hunters and gatherers, clever in survival but simple in ambition, wandering without cities or temples. Yet when the earth yields secrets, the story grows more complicated, and the neat line of progress becomes a tangle. For centuries, the Great Pyramids of Egypt stood as the ultimate beginning of architecture, monuments so old they seemed eternal. They were thought to anchor the dawn of human achievement. But in the last decades of the 20th century, archaeologists began to find evidence that shook this belief. Sites emerged that were older than the pyramids by millennia. Stones arranged in circles, pillars carved with animals, layers of soil hiding entire forgotten worlds. The shock was not only in the dates, but in the realization that people once thought incapable of such works had left behind legacies in stone. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in the hills of southeastern Turkey was one such revelation. Here, buried beneath a mound of earth, lay megalithic pillars arranged in enclosures, some weighing as much as 20 tons. Carved into them were lions, vultures, snakes, and abstract symbols, patterns so deliberate they spoke of intention and skill. Radiocarbon dating placed the site around 9,600 years before the Common Era. That is 7,000 years older than the pyramids and 5,000 years older than Stonehenge. What startled scholars most was that this was not the work of settled farmers or urban dwellers. The builders seemed to belong to a time before agriculture had fully taken root. Imagine standing there in that age, when the Ice Age had just loosened its grip on the world. The climate was shifting, rivers carved new paths, wild grains swayed in the wind. People still hunted gazelles and gathered berries, yet here in the Anatolian plateau they gathered in numbers large enough to raise monuments of stone. To carry, to carve, to organize, and to align such pillars required not only strength but vision. It hinted at something we had not expected of hunter-gatherers, a capacity for architecture, for ceremony, for belief. Archaeology, as a science, is cautious by nature. It builds narratives slowly, from shards and bones, from fragments of pottery, from seeds charred in ancient fires. To accept a temple 12,000 years old required overturning a framework built through centuries of scholarship. At first, many thought the dating must be wrong, that contamination or error had skewed the numbers. But excavation after excavation confirmed it. Layer by layer, the soil revealed that the site had been deliberately buried, preserved like a time capsule by the very people who had built it. It was not an accident of erosion, but an intentional closing of a chapter. The implications ripple outward. If such a site existed so long ago, what else might lie hidden under sediments and seas? The neat march of civilization from simple to complex, from tribe to city, is no longer so clear. Perhaps humanity experimented with complexity earlier than we assumed, rising and falling with climate and catastrophe, leaving behind only whispers of their presence. Perhaps the first civilizations were not the sudden miracle we once thought, but rather the survivors of forgotten ages who built again from memory. And so the story widens. From Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus, our gaze shifts back in time to a world we barely know. Göbekli Tepe is more than an archaeological site. It is a question carved in stone. Who built it? Why here? Why then? The answers remain buried in dust and conjecture. Yet this much is certain. Long before the pyramids pierced the sky, long before cities rose by rivers, humans had already begun to shape stone into meaning. But what was this place? And who built it? The earth remembers in ways that people forget. Beneath layers of soil, seeds, bones, and stone, stories are locked away until the patient hands of archaeologists uncover them. In the 20th century, when Göbekli Tepe first revealed itself, the reaction was disbelief. The excavation team expected a modest Neolithic village, perhaps scattered hearths or traces of primitive farming. What they found instead was a structure so monumental that it rivaled the great stone works of much later eras. The first glimpses of the T-shaped pillars rising from the earth carried with them a sense of unease, as though history itself had shifted underfoot. At the time of its discovery, the accepted timeline was still a straight path. First, humans tamed plants and animals. Then, they settled into permanent villages. Only after centuries of agricultural stability did they develop surplus resources that allowed them to build temples, monuments, and complex societies. Göbekli Tepe defied this sequence. Here stood an immense ceremonial complex from a time when people were still supposed to be wandering the plains, following herds, and surviving day by day. How could nomads have organized themselves to cut, move, and raise pillars weighing tens of thousands of kilograms? The riddle forced scholars to re-examine their assumptions. The stones themselves seem to speak. Each is carved with animals, not as crude scratches but as deliberate reliefs, carefully shaped to stand out in profile. Lions crouch, vultures spread their wings, serpents coil, and wild boars stride across the surfaces. These were not idle decorations but deliberate symbols chosen to convey meaning. What they meant, we do not yet know, but they echo across millennia, reminding us that symbolism was alive long before writing etched its first marks on clay. Standing at the site today, one senses a silence deeper than time. The wind moves over the Anatolian plateau, stirring the grasses, while the great pillars rise like guardians of memory. To walk among them is to feel the weight of thousands of generations, the echo of voices that once sang or prayed in circles beneath the stars. In those days, the night sky would have blazed with unpolluted brilliance. Constellations would have burned clear, horizons would have stretched untouched, and the rhythms of the heavens may have guided the hands that raised the stones. It is easy to imagine the gathering of people here. Hunters arriving with gazelles slung over their shoulders. Women carrying baskets of gathered grains. Children running in the dust while fires were lit and torches cast their glow on the carvings. Perhaps chants rose, perhaps dances were performed, perhaps offerings were placed in the earth. Though we cannot know the exact rituals, we can feel the purpose that bound them together. It was not survival alone, but belief, imagination, and community. The mystery deepens when we consider how the site was buried. For reasons still debated, the builders filled in their own creation with earth and debris. Every enclosure, every pillar, was carefully entombed. It was not abandoned to erosion, but sealed away, almost as if preserved for the future. Why would a people who invested so much labor in raising these monuments then choose to hide them? Some suggest that new enclosures were built over old ones in a cycle of renewal. Others believe that the burial was a deliberate ending, a ritual closure marking a shift in culture. Whatever the reason, their choice preserved the site better than chance ever could. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more layers appear, each older than the last. Beneath one circle of pillars lies another, and beneath that, yet another. The site tells us that its builders returned again and again across centuries, shaping, carving, and transforming the space. It was not a single moment, but a tradition, a continuity that stretched across generations. Such continuity requires more than chance gatherings. It demands memory, organization, and a shared vision carried forward by countless hands. If we accept Göbekli Tepe as a temple, it becomes the oldest known place of worship ever constructed by human beings. If we accept it as a city, then it predates the first urban centers by thousands of years. Perhaps it was both, or something in between. A ceremonial gathering place that drew scattered groups together, uniting them in rituals that laid the foundations for later civilizations. Whatever the case, it redefines what it means to be human. It suggests that our ancestors were capable of architecture, cooperation, and abstract thought long before the textbooks say they should have been. To walk backward in time is to walk into a fog. We rely on fragments, on stone that survives when wood and cloth rot away. We rely on charred grains, on bones gnawed by fire, on the faint traces of pigments. Yet in Göbekli Tepe we have more than fragments. We have pillars that still stand, circles that still curve, and carvings that still shout their defiance against forgetting. The people who built them may be gone, but their vision lingers in every chisel mark, every alignment, every buried layer. And still the greatest question lingers. Who were they? Were they the hunters and gatherers we think we know? Or were they something more? Were they the first to dream of permanence? Or were they inheritors of a tradition already old when they raised their stones? To search for answers, we must continue to dig, not only in the soil of Anatolia but in the deeper layers of human history itself. The mystery before history is not only about the past, it is about us, about what it means to be human, about how early imagination and faith can move mountains of stone. The stones of Göbekli Tepe whisper that civilization's roots run deeper than we once believed, tangled in times when the world was younger, harsher, yet filled with minds as sharp and creative as our own. And as we stand among these pillars of silence, we prepare to ask the next question. Not only what was built, but why. Not only who carved the lions and vultures, but what they meant to the people who danced beneath them. This question leads us forward, from the mystery of history's foundations to the enigma of the first temple ever raised by human hands. But what did the builders of Göbekli Tepe truly intend? The story of human origins has always been told as though it were a straight line. First survival, then farming, then villages, then temples and writing, finally leading to the great empires whose monuments still stand. Yet Göbekli Tepe suggests that the path was not straight at all, but winding, full of detours and experiments, with triumphs now forgotten. To acknowledge this is to face an unsettling possibility. What if the rise of civilization is not a unique miracle that occurred once in Mesopotamia, but a rhythm that has played out many times in many places, with most of its notes lost to time? Archaeologists often compare the work of excavation to peeling back layers of a book that has been buried. Each stratum is a page, each artifact a word, each ruin a sentence. But sometimes, whole chapters have been torn out and hidden. Göbekli Tepe is one such missing chapter. For thousands of years it lay unseen, covered by soil, while above it empires rose and fell, wars raged, languages were born and died, and new faiths took hold. Only in the late 20th century did human eyes once again fall upon its stones. That it remained untouched for so long is a reminder that the earth holds many secrets still, waiting in silence until we are ready to find them. Consider the sheer labor that went into its construction. To cut limestone from nearby quarries with stone tools, to shape it into smooth T-shaped pillars, to transport these blocks across uneven ground without wheels or beasts of burden, required a coordination of effort, difficult even for more advanced societies. How many hands were needed to haul a pillar of 20 tons? How many minds to plan the enclosures? How many years to complete a circle of stones? Each question reveals that the builders were far more organized than we once imagined for their era. And yet they left no writing. Their story is etched in animals and symbols, but not in words. Unlike later civilizations that left us tablets, scrolls, and inscriptions, the people of Göbekli Tepe spoke only through images and stone. This absence sharpens the mystery, for it forces us to imagine without clear translation. The vultures, the foxes, the snakes, the abstract symbols, all hint at meanings we cannot fully decipher. Were they marks of clans, signs of the sky, or stories of gods? Every interpretation is tentative, every answer provisional. Still, the persistence of these symbols shows that belief and imagination were already powerful forces. The builders were not only concerned with food and shelter, they carved their world into stone because they sought meaning beyond survival. Perhaps they believed the animals held spiritual power. Perhaps they watched the stars and carved constellations into the pillars. Perhaps they felt the presence of forces larger than themselves, and the circles of stone were meant to give shape to the unseen. In this way, Göbekli Tepe is less about the past and more about the timeless human impulse to search for order in chaos, to seek patterns, to reach for something greater. The burial of the site becomes even more intriguing in this light. To create such a place, to invest so much labor and imagination, and then to entomb it deliberately, suggests a profound change. It may reflect a shift in belief, a transformation of culture, or even a response to catastrophe. The Younger Dryas, a period of sudden climate change about 12,000 years ago, had reshaped landscapes and tested human resilience. Rapid warming, flooding, and shifting environments may have forced people to abandon old ways and adopt new ones. Could Göbekli Tepe have been buried as part of this transformation, a symbolic closure of an age? The discovery also reverberates in the broader story of civilization. If hunter-gatherers could build such temples, then the old assumption that agriculture came first must be reconsidered. It may be that organized religion or shared belief gave rise to agriculture, not the other way around. People may have gathered first for ritual, creating social bonds that later encouraged permanent settlement and farming. If so, then the roots of civilization lie not in fields of wheat but in circles of stone where people prayed beneath the stars. For the modern world, this realization is humbling. We have long thought of ourselves as the pinnacle of progress, each generation building upon the last in a ladder of improvement. Yet the stones of Göbekli Tepe whisper that human imagination has always been vast, even in ages we call primitive. The people who carved lions into stone 12,000 years ago were as human as we are. Their hands, their eyes, their dreams were no less capable of vision. They remind us that history is not only about kings and empires, but about the silent work of communities whose names we will never know. And so the mystery before history deepens. Each discovery pushes the dawn of civilization further back. Each new layer suggests that what we know is only a fragment of what was. The story we tell about ourselves is being rewritten, not in ink but in stone, unearthed one pillar at a time. As archaeologists scrape the soil from carvings buried for millennia, they reveal not only the past but also our own tendency to underestimate the depth of human spirit. The question now is not whether Göbekli Tepe is an anomaly, but whether it is the first of many. If such a site can lie hidden for 12,000 years, then how many others remain unseen beneath deserts, forests, and seas? How many chapters of our story are still waiting in silence, waiting to remind us that civilization may be older, stranger, and more resilient than we dare imagine? This is why Göbekli Tepe matters. It is not only a ruin, it is a mirror held up to humanity, showing us that the urge to create, to believe, and to remember has been with us since the beginning. Long before the pyramids reached for the sky, long before the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, long before the Indus Valley laid its bricks, people were already gathering, carving, and dreaming. And from this mystery, the story flows onward. To understand what was truly built on that Anatolian plateau, we must walk deeper into the labyrinth of the past. From the pillars and their carvings, from the soil and its secrets, we turn now to ask the next question. What if Göbekli Tepe was not only the first temple, but the first whisper of civilization itself? The story of its discovery begins quietly, almost by chance, in the early 1990s. A shepherd walking the dry hills near Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey noticed a stone that seemed different from the rest, a fragment rising just above the soil. To him, it was only another rock in a landscape littered with them, but to archaeologists it became the first clue of something extraordinary. Excavations soon revealed not a single stone, but the buried remnants of vast enclosures, circles of megalithic pillars standing in deliberate formation. What emerged was not a village, not a mere camp, but the oldest known ceremonial complex ever uncovered, a place later called Göbekli Tepe. The stones themselves are silent yet eloquent. Each is shaped into a T, rising high above the ground, some towering over 5 meters in height and weighing as much as 20 tons. They are not crude blocks but carefully smoothed and balanced, arranged in circles that once enclosed spaces where people gathered. At the heart of each enclosure stand 2 larger pillars, like guardians or deities presiding over the circle. Their forms are abstract yet unmistakably anthropomorphic, their sides carved with arms and hands folded across the belly, their heads absent as though representing something beyond the human. These central figures seem to anchor the entire structure, the axis around which ritual revolved. The carvings on the pillars are a gallery of the ancient world. Lions stalk across the stone, wild boars bristle with life, vultures spread wings, foxes slink, and serpents coil. Each relief is precise, suggesting not only artistic skill, but deep familiarity with the creatures of the surrounding landscape. Some animals are depicted in aggressive poses, others in symbolic arrangements, their meanings lost to us, but no doubt vivid to those who carved them. Interspersed among the animals are abstract shapes, circles, H-like figures, and other symbols whose interpretations remain debated. Are they marks of clans, signs of the cosmos, or expressions of myth? Each possibility only widens the mystery. Dating the site changed history. Radiocarbon analysis of organic remains embedded in the soil placed its construction around 9,600 years before the Common Era. That makes Göbekli Tepe older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years and older than the pyramids by 7,000 years. At a time when the world was still shaking off the Ice Age, when much of humanity lived in small mobile bands, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were already cutting and raising monuments of stone. The implications are profound. The site forces us to reconsider the order in which human culture developed. Traditionally, archaeologists believed that agriculture came first. People learned to plant grains, domesticate animals, and store surplus food. This stability allowed population growth, permanent settlements, and eventually the resources to build temples and monuments. Yet Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite. Here was a vast temple complex built before the establishment of farming villages. It implies that the desire for ritual and community, the shared act of worship, may have been the spark that drew people together. In this view, agriculture followed religion, not the other way around. People may have begun cultivating plants to feed gatherings at temples, not to create them. The discovery shocked the academic world. Some resisted at first, suggesting the dates must be wrong, the interpretations exaggerated. But as excavation continued and more enclosures were revealed, the evidence grew undeniable. Here stood a temple complex thousands of years older than any known city, older even than the myths of Mesopotamia. And it had been buried deliberately, filled in by its builders, as though sealing away a sacred chapter of their lives. This intentional burial preserved the site like a time capsule, protecting carvings from erosion and leaving future generations to rediscover them. Today, walking among the excavated enclosures is to stand at the threshold of human imagination. The limestone pillars rise like silent sentinels, their carved animals still visible under the Turkish Sunday. Visitors are struck by their scale and by the realization that such a place was built without metal tools, without wheels, without beasts of burden. The labor was immense, the coordination remarkable, the vision undeniable. It speaks of a society capable of planning, organizing, and sustaining large gatherings of people, all united by shared belief. As night falls over the plateau, the imagination drifts further. In the dark sky above, countless stars blaze, unhindered by modern lights. It is easy to picture ancient hands pointing upward, tracing patterns across the heavens, then carving those same patterns into stone. Some scholars suggest that the arrangement of animals may represent constellations, an early form of astronomy preserved in rock. If true, then Göbekli Tepe is not only the first temple, but also one of the first observatories, a place where sky and earth met in ritual. The site has been called the first temple of humanity because it marks the moment when belief took material form on a monumental scale. It was not a shelter, not a house, not a storehouse, but a place built for meaning, for ceremony, for connection between people and the unseen. It redefines what it means to be human, showing that imagination and faith are as old as any tool, as vital as any harvest. Yet questions remain. Who were the builders? What myths guided their hands? What compelled them to raise stones taller than themselves and carve animals that seemed to leap from the surface? To seek these answers, we must look more closely at the builders themselves, at the hunters and gatherers of the early Neolithic, who may have been far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. And so the story moves forward, from the discovery of the first temple to the people who carved it, lived with it, and ultimately buried it. Who were they, and what legacy did they leave behind? The first excavation season had already shaken the foundations of archaeology, yet each passing year added new puzzles. The more soil was cleared, the more circles of stone emerged, some still half buried, others toppled by time but preserved in outline. It became clear that Göbekli Tepe was not a single construction, but a complex built and rebuilt over centuries, with older layers lying beneath newer ones. Some enclosures had weathered pillars, others sharper carvings, each a snapshot of different generations returning to the same sacred ground. This continuity tells us something profound about its builders. Hunter-gatherers are often imagined as mobile, restless, without permanent ties to place. But here was evidence of long-term commitment. For hundreds of years, perhaps longer, groups returned to this hill to quarry, carve, and set stones in place. This was not the work of a transient camp, but of a tradition, a memory passed down across generations. Such persistence suggests more than survival. It points to ritual, to a shared identity, to a sense of belonging larger than the individual. The builders themselves lived in a world of transition. Around 10,000 years before the Common Era, the climate of the Near East was shifting. The last great ice age had ended, glaciers retreating and rivers carving new paths through fertile plains. Wild grains like einkorn and barley grew in abundance, and people began experimenting with gathering and tending them. Herd animals like gazelles, wild cattle, and sheep moved across the hills. The people of Göbekli Tepe hunted them, gathered plants, and perhaps, in small ways, began shaping the land. They were not yet farmers in the full sense, but they stood on the threshold of agriculture. This context makes their achievements even more striking. Without permanent villages, without plowed fields, without herds of domesticated animals, they coordinated the labor to cut and move megaliths. The largest pillars, weighing 20 tons, were quarried from nearby limestone outcrops and dragged across uneven ground. Experiments today suggest that dozens of people with ropes and levers could have achieved this, but it required planning and leadership. These were not disorganized bands, but communities with clear goals. The human figures carved into the central pillars are especially intriguing. Their folded arms and upright stance suggest more than abstraction. Some scholars see them as gods, others as ancestors, or perhaps as personifications of mythic beings. The lack of faces may point to a symbolic meaning, representing not individuals but roles. The enclosures may have been theaters of ritual, where stories were told through movement, chanting, and offerings. Imagine the flicker of firelight across the carved animals, shadows dancing across stone as voices rose into the night. The animal carvings may have carried layered meanings. Vultures, for example, appear prominently. In many early cultures, vultures were linked to death and the sky, carrying souls upward. At Göbekli Tepe, they may have symbolized transformation or passage between worlds. Snakes, common across the pillars, could have represented danger, renewal, or the boundary between life and death. Foxes appear repeatedly as well, perhaps associated with cunning or with the spirit world. Each animal may have held both practical and spiritual significance, drawn from observation of the natural world, but woven into myth. To understand the builders, we must also recognize their deliberate burial of the site. Filling in the enclosures with rubble and earth was no small task. It suggests that when they moved on, they did so with purpose, closing one chapter to begin another. This act preserved the carvings for us, but also raises questions. Did they abandon their temple because their beliefs changed? Did environmental pressures force them to migrate? Or was burial itself part of the ritual cycle, a way of renewing sacred space by entombing the old before raising the new? The discovery has forced scholars to reconsider the relationship between ritual and agriculture. Perhaps it was not that farming led to temples, but that temples led to farming. To sustain large gatherings for rituals, people needed food in abundance. To supply that food, they may have begun cultivating plants and managing animals. If this is true, then religion was the seed of civilization, not its byproduct. In this view, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not only carving stone, but also planting the foundations of the settled world. Each excavation deepens the mystery. Archaeologists uncover new enclosures, new carvings, new signs of sophistication, yet even as more is revealed, the core questions remain unanswered. Who exactly were the builders? What language did they speak? What stories did they tell as they raised their stones? We may never know their names, but through their work we glimpse their vision. They remind us that humanity has always sought meaning, always gathered in circles to share in something greater than survival. And so, as the dust is brushed from ancient carvings and the sun sets over the Anatolian plateau, we are left with an enduring truth. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not primitive wanderers. They were innovators, artists, and believers, shaping stone to mirror their world and perhaps the heavens above. To understand them more deeply, we must look closer at their lives, their society, and their beliefs. For if Göbekli Tepe is the first temple, then who were the first priests, the first visionaries, the first storytellers to breathe life into its stones? The stones stand in silence, but behind them were hands, voices, and minds. The builders of Göbekli Tepe lived 12,000 years ago, in a world straddling the line between the Ice Age and the dawn of farming. They were not faceless shadows wandering in anonymity. They were men and women, hunters and gatherers, innovators and believers. To understand their achievement, we must step into their lives, piecing together what archaeology, climate, and anthropology can tell us. Their world was raw and shifting. Glaciers had retreated, rivers carved new valleys, and wild plants grew across the fertile crescent. These people moved with the seasons, hunting gazelles and aurochs, gathering nuts, berries, and wild grains. They did not yet build permanent villages, yet they gathered in numbers large enough to quarry limestone, drag megaliths, and raise them into circles of stone. The old model of history says such feats required agriculture first, but here was proof that the impulse to create monuments came earlier, born not of farming surplus, but of shared vision. The builders left no writing, so their names, their stories, their languages are lost. What remains are bones, tools, and carvings. Flint blades and arrowheads litter the site, signs of skilled craftsmanship. Animal remains show large feasts, perhaps tied to rituals that drew people from across the region. Imagine hundreds gathering at the hill, bringing food, trading, sharing stories. Such gatherings required coordination, memory, and trust. They reveal that hunter-gatherers were not isolated groups, but part of a larger network bound by ritual and exchange. At the heart of their world was belief. The vultures carved into stone may have symbolized death and the journey of the soul. Snakes, foxes, and boars may have carried meanings drawn from myth and nature. The twin central pillars in each circle, carved with arms and hands, may have represented deities or ancestors. Without writing, we cannot be certain, but the persistence of symbols across enclosures tells us they had a shared system of meaning, passed down through generations. This was not random decoration, but language without words, myth written in stone. The burial of the enclosures deepens the mystery of the builders. To fill in the spaces with rubble and earth was no small task. It suggests ritual closure, a deliberate act of ending. Perhaps each generation buried the old to build anew, layering meaning over centuries. Or perhaps they abandoned their temple when beliefs changed, sealing it away with reverence. Either way, the act tells us they were not passive wanderers but intentional architects of their spiritual world. Archaeology now sees them in a new light. They were not merely hunters chasing herds, but people capable of cooperation on a scale larger than any small band. They organized labor, shared myths, and created architecture before farming bound them to soil. Their work suggests that the roots of civilization lie not in fields of wheat but in circles of stone, where humans first gathered in shared imagination. And so, the builders of Göbekli Tepe remind us that complexity is not born only of agriculture and kings. It is born of belief, of vision, of the human desire to connect with forces beyond ourselves. They carved their faith into stone and left it buried for us to find. But Göbekli Tepe may not stand alone. Across the world, other sites whisper similar stories, places that should not exist according to our old timelines. To continue this journey, we must look beyond Anatolia to the scattered ruins that challenge our understanding of the past. The question of who built Göbekli Tepe has stirred debate since the first stones were unearthed. For decades, scholars assumed that only farming societies could organize the labor, resources, and social structure needed for such a feat. Agriculture was seen as the foundation on which temples, monuments, and cities were built, but Göbekli Tepe disrupts this tidy order. It was raised before fields of wheat were cultivated, before sheep and goats were tamed, before villages dotted the Fertile Crescent. Its existence suggests that hunter-gatherers, often thought of as simple nomads, were far more capable than we once believed. Some argue that the builders were not pure hunter-gatherers but people already experimenting with cultivation. Wild einkorn wheat grew in abundance nearby, and genetic studies trace the origins of domesticated wheat to this very region. It is possible that groups who gathered at Göbekli Tepe were already tending patches of grain, beginning the slow shift toward farming. If so, the temple and the birth of agriculture may have been entwined, each driving the other. The need to feed large gatherings for ritual could have encouraged deliberate planting, and farming in turn allowed greater gatherings. In this way, belief and cultivation may have risen together, intertwined at the roots of civilization. Yet the scale of Göbekli Tepe still astonishes. To quarry, shape, and move pillars weighing 20 tons without wheels, metal, or beasts of burden required cooperation beyond the small bands typical of hunter-gatherers. It implies that hundreds, perhaps thousands, came together, united by a shared purpose. That purpose, it seems, was not survival alone but ritual, ceremony, and the search for meaning. In this light, Göbekli Tepe challenges the idea that religion is a byproduct of civilization. Instead, it may have been the spark that lit the path toward it. Life for the builders would have been harsh yet vibrant. They hunted wild cattle, gazelles, and boars. They gathered nuts, berries, and grains from the hills. They lived in temporary shelters of wood, reed, and hide, moving with the seasons. And yet, amid this mobility, they invested immense energy into a site that was anything but temporary. They carved animals into stone not for utility, but for memory and meaning. They returned generation after generation, embedding continuity into a world of change. The debate over their identity reflects larger questions in archaeology. Were these people the ancestors of the first farmers, standing on the edge of a new era? Or were they a different group entirely? Innovators who built the first temple but whose way of life eventually faded? Some suggest that Göbekli Tepe was a gathering place for multiple groups across the region, a sacred center where scattered bands met to reaffirm bonds, trade, and share rituals. In this view, the site was less a city than a ceremonial hub, a magnet that drew people together. What is certain is that the builders were not primitive. Their tools, though simple stone, were used with precision. Their organization, though unwritten, was effective. Their imagination, though silent in words, speaks through pillars that still stand 12,000 years later. They remind us that intelligence and creativity are not measured only by technology. Even without pottery, writing, or metallurgy, they carved a vision into the earth that endures. The burial of Göbekli Tepe adds one more layer to the puzzle. It was not left to crumble, but deliberately entombed. This suggests a culture with rituals of closure, capable of long-term planning and symbolism. To bury a temple is an act of meaning, one that echoes across time. It shows that the builders thought not only of the present but of the future, of how their sacred spaces would be remembered or transformed. In studying them, we see the first glimmers of organized religion, the first communities bound not only by kinship, but by shared myth. These builders were the ancestors of all who came after, not in blood alone, but in imagination. They set the precedent for temples, cities, and civilizations yet unborn. And as we look at their legacy, we realize that Göbekli Tepe may not be unique. Across the ancient world, other sites emerge that challenge the timeline, places that suggest humanity has experimented with complexity many times. To understand the builders fully, we must widen our view beyond this single hill, to the scattered ruins that whisper of forgotten worlds. The story of the builders is written not only in stone, but also in the traces of their rituals. Archaeologists have unearthed countless animal bones around the enclosures, many from gazelles, wild cattle, and deer. These remains suggest large feasts, communal gatherings where hundreds, perhaps even thousands, shared in meals that marked ceremonies. To feed such numbers required coordination, planning, and resources beyond the daily needs of survival. The feasts themselves may have been part of the ritual, binding groups together in shared celebration and belief. The scale of the gatherings speaks of social complexity. Hunter-gatherer bands are often imagined as small, scattered, rarely numbering more than a few dozen. Yet Göbekli Tepe required a much larger community. The organization of labor, the timing of construction, and the provision of food point to networks of cooperation across wide areas. Different groups may have converged seasonally, uniting for ritual before dispersing again. In these moments, identity expanded beyond family or tribe to something larger, something shared. In the shadow of the Great Pillars, people became part of a collective vision. The symbolic power of the site lies in its carvings. The twin central pillars, carved with arms and hands, may represent human-like figures or deities. Their facelessness suggests they were not individuals, but archetypes, embodying forces beyond the human. The surrounding animals may have been more than decoration. They may have told stories of creation, death and rebirth, or mapped constellations across the night sky. The repetition of symbols hints at a coherent system of meaning, a proto-religion born before writing. To carve such symbols into stone was to make them eternal, to give form to beliefs that bound people together. This binding force may have been the true foundation of civilization. Before farming fixed people to the land, before kings commanded armies, shared belief provided the glue that held communities together. Religion may not have been a product of settled life, but its cause. The desire to gather, to worship, to create meaning together may have driven people to cultivate plants, domesticate animals, and settle in permanent places. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe is not only the first temple, but the spark that lit the path towards civilization itself. And yet, the builders also chose to bury their creation. This act of closure, repeated across multiple enclosures, suggests a rhythm of renewal. Perhaps each generation entombed the work of the last, layering history in soil. Perhaps new myths required new spaces, and old symbols were respectfully retired. Whatever the reason, the burial shows that the builders saw time not as linear but cyclical, with rituals of ending as important as those of beginning. Their worldview was as complex as their architecture. When we imagine these people, we must shed the notion of primitive wanderers. They were artists, organizers, and visionaries. They lived close to the land, but their minds reached for the heavens. They hunted and gathered, but they also carved and believed. Their lives remind us that intelligence and imagination are not tied to technology alone. Long before writing or wheels, humans were already shaping monuments of meaning. As the wind sweeps over the Anatolian plateau and the sun sets behind the hills, the stones of Göbekli Tepe stand as witnesses to this truth. The builders may be gone, but their vision endures. They remind us that humanity has always sought more than survival, always gathered in circles, always reached for meaning in a vast and mysterious world. But Göbekli Tepe is not the only site that challenges our understanding. Across the earth, ruins appear where they should not, older than our timelines allow, hinting at forgotten chapters of history. From the ancient walls of Jericho to the enigmatic stones beneath the sea, other sites beckon with questions as profound as those of Göbekli Tepe. The mystery deepens as we turn our gaze outward. What if Göbekli Tepe is only the beginning of a pattern, one thread in a tapestry of lost worlds waiting to be remembered? Long before the spires of Mesopotamia and the pyramids of Egypt, other places rose from the soil, places that by every rule of history should not be there. They are older than expected, stranger than expected, and their very existence disrupts the line we thought we understood. Some stand on dry land, their walls still visible against the horizon. Others lie hidden beneath waves, shrouded in currents and speculation. Together, they remind us that Göbekli Tepe may not be an isolated wonder, but part of a deeper story written across the world. One of the oldest known cities is Jericho, a settlement on the banks of the Jordan River. Archaeological layers reveal habitation stretching back to around 10,000 years before the Common Era, roughly the same age as the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe. Here, people built walls and towers of stone, structures far more permanent than the temporary shelters of nomads. The Tower of Jericho, rising over 8 meters, is one of the oldest monumental structures in human history. Its builders were not supposed to exist at that time, yet they did, shaping stone with purpose and planning. Jericho tells us that urban life began earlier than we imagined, and that the urge to settle and build was stronger than we once thought. Farther to the north, in central Anatolia, lies another ancient site, Çatalhöyük. Flourishing around 7,000 years before the Common Era, it is often called one of the first true cities. Here, thousands of people lived in closely packed houses built of mud brick, entered through holes in the roof rather than doors. Walls were painted with vibrant murals of animals and geometric designs. Inside homes, burials were placed beneath floors, ancestors literally beneath the feet of the living. Life at Çatalhöyük was complex, with evidence of trade, ritual, and social organization. This city challenges the notion that urban life needed kings or palaces to begin. It shows that communities could thrive in density long before the empires of Sumer or Egypt. If Jericho and Çatalhöyük rewrite the story on land, then ruins beneath the sea whisper even more haunting possibilities. Off the coast of India lies Dwarka, a submerged city mentioned in ancient texts. Divers have found stone structures, walls, and artifacts beneath the waters of the Gulf of Cambat. Radiocarbon dating of materials recovered from the seabed suggests ages far older than expected, though debates continue over the interpretation. Some scholars argue that currents deposit debris that mimics man-made forms, while others see genuine traces of a drowned city. The controversy reflects the difficulty of working in shifting seas, but the possibility remains that entire settlements were lost when rising waters swallowed coastlines after the Ice Age. Another enigmatic site lies near the Japanese island of Yonaguni. Beneath the waves lies a vast structure of terraces, steps, and platforms carved from stone. Some argue it is natural, the product of geological fracturing. Others see clear evidence of human design, with straight lines, right angles, and even the likeness of faces carved into rock. If Yonaguni is indeed a city, it would push back the timeline of complex construction by thousands of years. If it is natural, it still reminds us that human eyes are drawn to patterns, and that the boundary between nature and culture is not always easy to define. The debate over these sites reveals the tension between skepticism and possibility. Archaeologists demand hard evidence, datable artifacts, clear signs of human modification. Without them, the risk of misinterpretation looms large. Yet to dismiss such places too quickly is to risk overlooking genuine history. After all, Göbekli Tepe itself was once thought impossible until excavation proved otherwise. The challenge is to walk the line between imagination and evidence, to question boldly but also to test carefully. Whether on land or underwater, these places share a common theme. They should not exist, yet they do. They whisper that humanity has built, settled, and perhaps even forgotten, far earlier than we once believed. And if entire cities can vanish beneath waves or lie buried for millennia, then how much of our story still lies hidden? The mystery deepens. Could these sites be survivors of forgotten cataclysms, echoes of worlds erased by flood, fire, or shifting earth? To answer, we must turn to the myths of the Great Flood, stories repeated across continents, tales that may hold memories of real events when seas rose and lands disappeared. The ruins of Jericho still stand under the blazing sun of the Jordan Valley, silent walls of stone that speak of a permanence out of step with their age. Archaeologists peeling back the layers have found evidence of occupation stretching over millennia, each stratum a testimony to lives lived and rebuilt on the same ground. The Tower of Jericho, rising taller than any human of its time, was a statement in stone. 8 meters of masonry stood above the plain, connected to a wall that enclosed the settlement. What purpose it served remains uncertain. Some argue it was defensive, a bulwark against enemies. Others suggest it was ceremonial, aligned to catch the light of the setting sun at certain times of the year. Whatever its function, the tower is proof that even in the 10th millennium before the Common Era, humans were already shaping landscapes with ambition and skill. Çatalhöyük, on the Anatolian plateau, offers an even more vivid glimpse into the lives of early builders. Unlike Jericho, which was ringed by walls, Çatalhöyük was a sprawling cluster of homes pressed together in a honeycomb of mud brick. There were no streets. People moved across rooftops, entering their houses through openings in the ceiling. Inside, walls were painted with hunting scenes, bulls' heads were mounted in shrines, and geometric designs adorned surfaces. The dead were buried beneath the very floors where the living slept and worked, their bones discovered under layers of plaster. This merging of life and death, of art and ritual, shows a society deeply rooted in symbolism. It was not a kingdom, for there is no sign of rulers or palaces. Instead, it was a community where ritual and daily life intertwined, a city without kings, yet full of meaning. These ancient settlements remind us that the birth of cities was not a sudden leap, but a gradual unfolding. People experimented with permanence in many forms. Some built towers and walls. Others packed houses together in endless rows. Each experiment reveals that humans have long sought to gather, to live in density, to create spaces where stories, rituals, and lives converge. The idea of urban life, far from being an invention of later empires, was seeded in these early centuries, long before the names of Sumer or Egypt entered the record. But the story is not confined to dry land. The sea has its own secrets, hidden beneath waves that rose as the Ice Age ended. Around 12,000 years ago, the great glaciers melted and oceans swelled. Coastlines shifted, swallowing valleys and plains where people had once walked. If villages or cities stood there, they are now drowned, preserved in silence beneath the sea. This possibility gives weight to legends like Dwarka, the ancient city of India said to have been built by the god Krishna and swallowed by the ocean. For centuries it was considered myth, but in the early 2000s, sonar scans and diving expeditions revealed structures on the seabed of the Gulf of Khumbat. Divers reported stone blocks, walls, and artifacts buried in silt. Some carbon samples from materials found there suggested great age, perhaps older than the Indus Valley civilization itself. Critics argued that currents deposit natural debris that can mimic human structures, and that dating submerged material is fraught with difficulty. Yet the mystery remains unresolved. If Dwarka or other coastal sites were real settlements, then rising seas may have erased entire chapters of human history. Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan, adds another layer to the puzzle. Beneath clear waters lies a vast formation of terraces, platforms, and stair-like steps cut into stone. Divers have traced sharp angles and flat surfaces that seem deliberate, even architectural. Some claim to see faces carved into rock, the remnants of a sunken city. Others insist it is natural, a geological formation shaped by currents and time. The truth is contested, but the fascination endures. For if Yonaguni is indeed a city, it would rewrite the story of human construction, pushing its origins back thousands of years. Whether natural or man-made, these underwater formations provoke the imagination. They remind us that the line between geology and architecture is thin, and that our hunger for meaning often fills gaps in the evidence. But they also remind us that the sea rose rapidly at the end of the Ice Age, drowning coastal lands where humans surely lived. The archaeological record is biased toward places that survived on dry ground. Countless others may lie hidden beneath waves, their stories lost unless technology allows us to rediscover them. The pattern is clear. From Jericho's tower to Çatalhöyük's murals, from Dwarka's submerged stones to Yonaguni's terraces, the world is filled with places that stretch the boundaries of accepted history. Some are undeniable, some controversial, some natural but inspiring, yet all of them serve the same purpose. They show us that the human story is far older and more complex than the simple sequence we once believed. And so the question deepens: could these scattered ruins be connected, not in direct contact but in the echoes of memory? Could they be survivors of forgotten cataclysms, fragments of worlds erased by floods and time? To explore this possibility, we must turn from stone to story, from archaeology to myth, to the ancient tales of floods that appear across cultures and continents. The line between myth and memory begins to blur when we look at these places that should not exist. Jericho with its tower, Çatalhöyük with its painted walls, Dwarka with its drowned stones, Yonaguni with its terraces beneath the sea, all of them whisper that humanity's story is older, richer, and stranger than the neat timeline we once believed. They challenge us to accept that civilization has always been an experiment, tried and abandoned, remembered and forgotten. If entire cities could vanish beneath the waves, then the legends of great floods take on new weight. Nearly every culture holds such a tale. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of a deluge sent by the gods. The Bible tells of Noah and his ark. In India, texts describe Manu, who was warned of a flood by a fish. In Mesoamerica, the Maya spoke of earlier worlds destroyed by water. The recurrence of this story across continents suggests that it may not be coincidence. It may be the echo of real events, memories of seas rising rapidly as the Ice Age ended, swallowing valleys and plains where people once lived. Geology supports this possibility. Around 12,000 years ago, as glaciers melted, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, drowning coastal lands across the world. Imagine entire river deltas, fertile and inhabited, slowly lost to the encroaching sea. Villages and perhaps cities would have been erased, their ruins preserved beneath silt and waves. Archaeology on land has shown us wonders like Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, and Çatalhöyük. What might we find beneath the seas if we had the tools to search thoroughly? The ruins we know, and the ones we suspect, remind us that history is not a straight line, but a series of cycles. People gather, build, flourish, and sometimes vanish. Catastrophes strike, seas rise, beliefs change, and the past is buried or drowned. What survives is fragmentary, leaving us to piece together the story from stones and myths. The sites that should not exist are not anomalies. They are signals that our narrative is incomplete, that whole chapters remain missing. And so, as we turn from stones to stories, from ruins to legends, we step into the realm of the flood. Could the myths of deluge, told across cultures, be the memory of a forgotten world? Could catastrophe have erased civilizations older than we imagined, leaving behind only scattered ruins and carved whispers in stone? To follow this trail, we must look at the evidence of the Great Flood, both in myth and in the earth itself, and see whether the stories of ancient peoples are memories of a real event that changed the course of humanity. The story of the flood runs like a thread through human memory. From Mesopotamia to India, from the Americas to the islands of the Pacific, cultures separated by oceans and centuries tell of waters that rose, of lands that vanished, of survivors who carried knowledge into a new age. These stories are too numerous, too consistent, to dismiss as coincidence. They suggest that the memory of a great catastrophe, or perhaps many catastrophes, is woven into our earliest myths. The Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed in clay nearly 4,000 years ago, tells of Utnapishtim, who was warned by the gods to build a boat before a great deluge. He gathered his family, his animals, and seeds of all living things, and when the waters receded, he released a bird to find dry land. The parallels to the biblical story of Noah are unmistakable, and both likely draw on even older Sumerian traditions. In India, the story of Manu describes a man saved by a fish who warned him of rising waters. The fish grew until it could tow Manu's boat to safety, carrying with him the seeds of all life. Among the Maya, the Popol Vuh speaks of earlier worlds destroyed by water, with only a few survivors to repopulate the earth. These tales reflect not only human imagination, but also echoes of events that shaped entire landscapes. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, the Younger Dryas period ended in sudden warming. Glaciers melted, and seas surged upward by more than 100 meters. Valleys where rivers had meandered became estuaries. Plains once rich with game and plants disappeared beneath waves. For people living at the edges of these changes, it must have felt like the world itself was ending. Flood myths may be the memory of those experiences, passed down through generations, reshaped into stories of gods and heroes but rooted in real trauma. The geological record supports this view. Sediment cores from the bottom of oceans reveal layers of rapid sea level rise, sudden shifts in temperature, and deposits from massive flooding events. One of the most striking examples is the flooding of the Black Sea basin around 7,000 years before the Common Era. As sea levels rose, water from the Mediterranean is thought to have breached the Bosporus, pouring into the lower basin and transforming a freshwater lake into the saltwater sea we know today. Villages along its shores would have been drowned, their people forced to flee. Some scholars have even suggested that this event could be the memory behind certain Near Eastern flood myths. But the Younger Dryas itself remains one of the great turning points. Around 12,900 years ago, global temperatures plummeted for over 1,000 years before rebounding suddenly. The cause is still debated. Some argue for massive glacial meltwater floods disrupting ocean currents. Others suggest volcanic eruptions or even an extraterrestrial impact that triggered wildfires and climate chaos. Whatever the cause, the shift was violent, reshaping ecosystems and forcing human communities to adapt quickly. It is within this crucible that sites like Göbekli Tepe emerged, perhaps as a response to uncertainty, a place where rituals sought to bring order to a changing world. For those who lived through it, the experience must have been overwhelming. Imagine watching familiar coastlines vanish year by year, rivers swelling, fertile hunting grounds turning into marshes or seas. Imagine storms of unusual strength, fires raging across landscapes, herds disappearing from old ranges. The trauma of such events would not be forgotten. It would be told and retold, shaped into myth, carried forward until it reached us as the stories of Noah, Utnapishtim, and Manu. The flood is not just a story of water, it is a story of forgetting. Entire cultures may have been erased, their settlements drowned, their monuments buried beneath silt. What we see today, scattered ruins, puzzling carvings, and myths of deluge, may be only the fragments left behind. Civilization as we know it may be one of many attempts, one of many cycles, with earlier chapters lost beneath the waves. But if catastrophe erased entire worlds, what traces remain? To answer this, we must look not only to the land, but to the carvings themselves, the symbols left in stone that may carry messages across millennia, whispers of what humanity endured and what it sought to remember. The end of the Ice Age was not a gentle thaw, but a drama written across continents. When the Younger Dryas drew to a close about 11,700 years ago, the planet warmed with astonishing speed. Glaciers that had covered vast areas retreated, rivers swelled, lakes overflowed, and the oceans rose. This rise was not uniform. In places, it was sudden and violent, as meltwater bursts poured into seas, causing catastrophic floods that reshaped coastlines. For the people who lived through it, the world itself seemed unstable. Lands that had provided food for generations were lost. Herds of animals migrated unpredictably. Forests advanced where once there had been tundra. The sky was filled with storms and the seasons shifted in ways no memory could predict. In such a time, stories were the only way to hold on to meaning. Oral traditions became vessels carrying memories of a world that was drowning. These stories became the flood myths that echo across humanity. Geologists studying ice cores in Greenland and sediment from oceans have identified rapid jumps in sea level, known as meltwater pulses. One of the most dramatic, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred about 14,600 years ago, raising the oceans by nearly 20 meters in only a few centuries. Imagine living on a coastal plain as the shoreline advanced day by day, swallowing hunting grounds, forests, and rivers. Generations would tell of the waters rising, and their descendants would remember those stories as tales of gods punishing humanity or of great heroes saving life from destruction. The Black Sea flood hypothesis provides one of the most vivid scenarios. About 7,000 years before the Common Era, rising Mediterranean waters may have surged through the Bosporus Strait, flooding a freshwater lake and creating the saltwater Black Sea. If true, it would have been a catastrophic event for the people living on the fertile shores. Their villages, farms, and shrines would have been submerged in weeks or months. Survivors would have fled to new lands, carrying with them stories of the deluge. Whether this particular event inspired later myths is debated, but it shows how real geological changes can give birth to legends. The Younger Dryas also coincides with theories of sudden cosmic impact. Some scientists have proposed that a fragmented comet may have struck or exploded over North America about 12,900 years ago, igniting wildfires and triggering abrupt cooling. This idea remains controversial, but if even partly true, it adds another layer of catastrophe to an already unstable time. For people who witnessed fire in the sky, sudden freezes, and collapsing ecosystems, myth was the only way to frame the incomprehensible. Gods, floods, and cosmic battles were ways to explain forces too vast to grasp. From the perspective of archaeology, this period was a crucible. It forced adaptation and invention. In some places, people clung to old ways, following herds and gathering wild foods. In others, they began experimenting with cultivation and herding. At Göbekli Tepe, they carved symbols into stone, perhaps to preserve memory or to call on powers to steady a shifting world. In every case, belief and ritual became tools for survival, offering order when nature itself seemed chaotic. When we read the flood myths now, we see more than allegory. We see fragments of truth carried across millennia. They are cultural fossils, preserving the memory of real floods, real losses, real catastrophes. They remind us that history is not only written in stone and bone, but in stories that carry echoes of events too immense to forget. Yet myths are not precise. They blur memory with imagination, mixing true events with symbolic meaning. To uncover the forgotten world, we must turn to both story and science, to carvings that may encode the sky, and to geology that reveals the Earth's past. It is here, in the union of myth and evidence, that we begin to glimpse the outlines of a world that once was, and of the catastrophe that swept it away. And so the flood becomes more than a myth. It becomes a lens through which to view the forgotten. Could entire cultures have vanished beneath those waters, leaving behind only scattered ruins and stories of survival? The answer may lie not only in the soil but also in the carvings of ancient sites, symbols that speak across millennia of catastrophe and memory. The flood myths endure because they speak to something deeper than imagination. They are echoes of survival, of people who witnessed their world unravel and carried the memory forward in stories. Across continents, the tales differ in detail but converge on a single theme. The waters rose, the land was lost, and only a few endured to rebuild. When archaeology and geology are placed beside these myths, they reveal a haunting possibility. Entire cultures may have been erased by catastrophe, leaving behind only whispers in stone and story. Picture a coastal plain at the end of the Ice Age. For centuries, families hunted and gathered along rivers that emptied into fertile deltas. Settlements dotted the landscape, perhaps not cities in the later sense, but villages with rituals, tools, and traditions. As the climate warmed, seas crept inland. What began as subtle encroachment became unstoppable, year after year taking more land. A grandfather tells his grandchildren that the shoreline is moving. A generation later, the grandchildren's children say the gods are angry. A generation after that, the story becomes the flood myth, polished by retelling until it is no longer geography but legend. The geological record confirms that such experiences were real. Meltwater pulses raised the oceans by tens of meters within human lifetimes. Entire land bridges disappeared. The English Channel opened, cutting Britain from Europe. The Bering Land Bridge sank, severing Asia from the Americas. Coastlines retreated worldwide, swallowing unknown numbers of settlements. Archaeology has barely begun to probe these submerged lands. Most of our discoveries come from chance encounters by divers or fishermen. The rest waits beneath silt and waves, preserved in silence. In this light, the flood myths are not exaggerations but cultural memory. The Ark of Noah, the boat of Utnapishtim, the rescue of Manu, all reflect the desperate human instinct to save life against rising waters. Some stories describe survivors carrying seeds, animals, and knowledge. Whether literal or symbolic, they show that people understood continuity, that survival meant more than bodies. It meant carrying forward the essence of a world to begin again. The Younger Dryas adds yet another layer. Sudden cooling, violent storms, and perhaps even cosmic impact created conditions of chaos. For those alive then, the world must have seemed cursed, shifting between fire and ice, flood and drought. The monuments of Göbekli Tepe may have been built in response, a way to impose order through ritual, to make sense of a cosmos that seemed unstable. The carvings of animals, vultures, and serpents may have been records of what they saw, symbols of forces that shaped their lives. The possibility that entire cultures were erased should humble us. History as we know it may be only the surface of a much deeper ocean. Civilizations may have risen, flourished, and perished long before the ones we celebrate in textbooks. Their ruins may lie beneath deserts or seas, their myths preserved in fragments across cultures. Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, and Çatalhöyük are the first glimpses of this forgotten world. The flood myths are its echoes. Together, they suggest that we are heirs to a far older story than we realize. And so we arrive at the threshold of symbols carved in stone. If floods and cataclysms erased entire worlds, what messages did survivors leave? At Göbekli Tepe and other ancient sites, animals and shapes are carved with precision, perhaps encoding memories, myths, or even astronomical events. These carvings may be the bridge between geology and legend, the evidence that ties catastrophe to culture. To follow the thread of the forgotten world, we must now listen to these carvings. They are the voices of ancestors across 12,000 years, speaking through symbols that still wait for us to understand. The stones of Göbekli Tepe are more than pillars. They are canvases. Upon their surfaces are etched animals, symbols, and shapes that reach across 12,000 years to speak in a language we have not yet fully learned to read. These carvings are the voices of a world without writing, where meaning was carried not on clay tablets or scrolls but in stone images that endure. To walk among them is to enter a gallery of prehistory, a place where myth and memory fuse into symbol. The most famous of these is the so-called vulture stone. On its face, a vulture spreads its wings beside a headless human figure. Other animals crowd the scene: scorpions, snakes, and abstract shapes that hint at celestial patterns. Scholars debate its meaning. Some see it as a ritual depiction of death, the vulture carrying the soul into the sky. Others suggest it encodes an astronomical event, perhaps a comet impact recorded by people who gazed at the heavens with naked eyes but sharp memory. One controversial theory holds that the carvings mark the date of a cosmic strike around 10,000 to 800 years before the Common Era, an event linked to the end of the Younger Dryas. Whether true or not, the carving shows that these people thought in symbols, that they sought to record truths larger than themselves. Elsewhere on the pillars, foxes slink, wild boars stride, serpents coil, and lions prowl. The animals are not randomly chosen. They recur with deliberate frequency, suggesting they formed part of a symbolic system, a language without words. The builders may have mapped the sky onto the earth, each animal standing for a constellation. The fox could mark one cluster of stars, the scorpion another, the vulture yet another. If this interpretation holds, then Göbekli Tepe may be one of the earliest observatories, a place where myth and astronomy merged. Even without such cosmic theories, the carvings reveal a depth of imagination. They are not crude scratches but reliefs of skill and intention. Some pillars show hands and arms carved along their sides, as if the stones themselves were human figures, guardians standing in eternal silence. To carve stone in this way required not only tools and strength, but also vision, a sense of permanence. These were not decorations meant to please the eye for a season. They were symbols meant to endure for millennia, to speak across time. Imagine the ceremonies beneath these carvings: fires lit, smoke rising into the night, chants echoing around the stone circles. The vulture carved on the pillar glows in the flickering light, the snake seems to move in the shadows, the fox's form shifts as torches pass. For those gathered, the carvings were not static. They were alive, part of the ritual, participants in the stories that bound the community together. The stones carried the voices of the ancestors and perhaps of the stars themselves. The persistence of these symbols matters. Across the ancient world, similar motifs appear. Serpents, vultures, lions, and other animals recur in distant cultures, carved into temples, painted on pottery, woven into myth. It raises the question, were these symbols independently invented, drawn from the shared human experience of nature, or do they hint at deeper connections, fragments of a symbolic language carried across lands and generations? What is certain is that the carvings of Göbekli Tepe are more than art. They are records. They are attempts to capture in stone what words could not yet express. They are humanity's first library, written not in letters but in images that endure against wind and time. And so, as we stand before these carvings, we must ask, What messages were the builders trying to send? Were they preserving myths of creation and death, memories of catastrophe, or maps of the heavens? Whatever the answer, their voices still whisper across 12,000 years, waiting for us to listen. But to hear them fully, we must look beyond Göbekli Tepe alone. For the same symbols echo in other places, across continents and cultures, suggesting that the language of stone was humanity's first attempt to speak across millennia. The vulture stone stands as the most enigmatic of all the carvings. Its images are stark and deliberate, a tableau etched in limestone that demands interpretation. The vulture, wings outstretched, seems to carry a sphere or disc above its back. Below it, a headless human form suggests death or transformation. To one side, a scorpion spreads its pincers, unmistakable in its detail. Other shapes fill the surface, some animal, some geometric. To those who first uncovered it, the stone seemed to whisper of ritual, of death rites, of belief in a journey beyond life. But to others, its symbols spoke of the sky, of constellations and cosmic events, preserved not in writing but in image. One provocative theory argues that the vulture stone encodes the memory of a celestial catastrophe, perhaps a comet impact that marked the end of the Younger Dryas around 10,800 years before the Common Era. The scorpion may represent the constellation we now call Scorpio. The vulture may align with another star cluster. The disk it carries could be the sun, the moon, or even a comet streaking across the heavens. If this interpretation is true, then the people of Göbekli Tepe were not only carving myths but recording astronomical observations of extraordinary events. They were storytellers of the cosmos. Skeptics urge caution. Without written words, interpretation of symbols is always uncertain. A vulture may be a vulture, a scorpion, only a scorpion. To impose constellations onto them may reflect our own imagination rather than theirs. Yet the persistence of similar symbols across cultures suggests they held deeper meanings. Vultures are associated with death in many traditions, from the sky burials of Central Asia to the sacred birds of Mesoamerica. Scorpions appear in myths from Mesopotamia to Egypt, often linked with danger, protection, or the underworld. Serpents coil through the stories of nearly every culture, symbols of life, death, and rebirth. The carvings of Göbekli Tepe are not isolated. In caves of France and Spain, painted thousands of years earlier, animals stride across walls in flickering torchlight. In later temples of Mesopotamia and Egypt, lions, snakes, and vultures guard the thresholds of sacred space. Across continents, the same images appear, reinvented but recognizable. This suggests that humanity has always turned to certain symbols to express the mysteries of life and death, of the earth and the sky. Whether by shared origin or independent invention, the result is the same, a symbolic vocabulary that transcends place and time. To the builders of Göbekli Tepe, these images may have been more than representation. They may have been living forces. To carve a vulture was not simply to depict it, but to summon its power. To carve a serpent was to give form to an eternal principle. The stones were not static, they were charged with meaning, activated in ritual, alive in the eyes of those who danced and prayed around them. The twin central pillars in each enclosure, with their arms carved along their sides, may have embodied mythic ancestors or deities. They stand like guardians, their faceless forms larger than life, presiding over the animals and symbols around them. Some scholars suggest they represent the union of sky and earth, of the human and the divine. Others see them as ancestors elevated to cosmic status, remembered in stone long after their bodies had returned to the soil. Whatever their identity, their presence reveals a society capable of abstract thought, of creating beings that transcended the human. The idea that Göbekli Tepe encodes astronomical knowledge is not as far-fetched as it once seemed. Ancient cultures across the world aligned monuments with the sky. Stonehenge in England aligns with solstices. The pyramids of Egypt mirror the stars of Orion. The temples of Mesoamerica are oriented to equinoxes and planetary cycles. It is not unreasonable to imagine that the people of Göbekli Tepe, with their unpolluted sky blazing with stars, might have done the same. Their symbols may have been maps of the heavens, guides to cycles of time, or records of celestial events that shook their world. Whether myth or astronomy, the carvings endure as messages across time. They tell us that 12,000 years ago, people were already using symbols to grasp forces beyond themselves. They remind us that imagination and observation are ancient companions, and that our earliest ancestors were not passive before the cosmos, but active interpreters of its signs. The question remains, were these carvings isolated inventions, the product of one brilliant culture on a hill in Anatolia? Or are they echoes of a wider symbolic system, a shared inheritance carried across continents? To answer, we must look outward, to the repetition of ancient symbols in distant lands, and ask whether they reveal a forgotten connection. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe reach beyond art and touch something elemental in the human story. They are echoes of an ancient symbolic language, one that seems to ripple outward across cultures and continents. The vulture, the serpent, the fox, the lion, these are not random choices but motifs that resonate across the ancient world. They appear in cave paintings in Europe, in the myths of Mesopotamia, in the sacred iconography of Egypt, in the temples of the Americas. It is as if humanity drew from a shared reservoir of symbols, or else carried fragments of meaning across vast distances and generations. Consider the serpent. At Göbekli Tepe, it coils along the stone, menacing and eternal. In Mesopotamia, serpents were guardians of sacred water. In Egypt, the serpent embodied chaos but also protection, encircling the sun god on his nightly journey. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent was a god of creation. The same image, reinvented again and again, suggests that the serpent carried meanings deeper than any single culture. It symbolized life and death, renewal and danger, the duality of creation itself. The vulture, too, is universal. At Göbekli Tepe, it spreads its wings beside a headless figure, perhaps a soul ascending. In Anatolia and Central Asia, real sky burials saw vultures consume the bodies of the dead, returning them to the heavens. In Egypt, vultures became symbols of motherhood and protection, wings outstretched across temple walls. To cultures separated by thousands of years, the bird of death was also the bird of eternity. Even abstract symbols repeat. The H shape carved into pillars at Göbekli Tepe reappears in later cultures, sometimes as a motif, sometimes as a glyph. Geometric forms that seem simple may have carried meanings of union, duality, or cosmic balance. The fact that they recur suggests they were not idle decorations but part of a larger vocabulary. These repetitions raise profound questions. Did distant cultures inherit fragments of a common symbolic language born in the deep past? Or are the images products of shared experience, the natural world inspiring the same responses in people across continents? Scholars debate fiercely. To claim a global lost civilization is to drift towards speculation. To insist on pure coincidence is to ignore the persistence of motifs too widespread to dismiss. The truth may lie somewhere between. Humans everywhere look to the same sky, the same earth, the same cycles of birth and death, and found the same symbols to express them. What Göbekli Tepe shows us is that this symbolic language was already alive 12,000 years ago. It was not the invention of later empires, but one of humanity's earliest tools of thought. Before writing, before cities, there were symbols. They bound people together, carried memory across generations, and turned experience into myth. And so the carvings do speak across millennia. They are humanity's first library, its first attempt to record meaning in durable form. Whether encoding astronomy, myth, or memory of catastrophe, they remain a message from ancestors who sought to be remembered. They remind us that imagination is as old as survival, and that meaning itself may be the foundation of civilization. But this recognition leads to a larger question. Were these carvings the isolated brilliance of a single culture, or traces of a wider inheritance now forgotten? Is the repetition of symbols across the world evidence of lost knowledge passed down, or of shared invention arising from the human encounter with nature and sky? To answer, we must explore the tension between diffusion and independent creation, between the idea of a lost civilization and the power of the human mind to reinvent. The next step in our journey is to confront the question directly. Was it lost knowledge, or was it shared invention? The stones whisper of meaning, but the question remains, did those meanings arise in one place? to be carried across the earth by forgotten travelers? Or did they emerge everywhere at once, born from the shared experience of being human beneath the same sky? This is the tension at the heart of the mystery. Was there a lost civilization, a mother culture whose knowledge diffused outward? Or were the symbols, temples, and myths we see across continents the natural inventions of different peoples facing the same questions of life, death, and the cosmos? The theory of diffusion imagines a forgotten root, a civilization that flourished in the deep past, whose ideas spread outward and survived in fragments. Proponents point to similarities between pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica, to serpent deities in Asia and the Americas, to flood myths across the world. They ask if such parallels are too strong to be coincidence. Could knowledge of astronomy, architecture, and myth have been carried across oceans long before recorded navigation? Could Göbekli Tepe itself be a remnant of such a culture, its symbols the seed of a global inheritance? Mainstream archaeology resists this idea, not out of stubbornness but from the demand for evidence. No traces of ships, no unmistakable artifacts, no genetic links confirm a vanished mother culture. To accept diffusion without proof risks slipping into fantasy. The danger of pseudoscience looms large, for history is littered with claims of Atlantis and lost continents, ideas that ignite imagination but crumble without support. Science must walk carefully, demanding evidence that can be tested and verified. Yet the other possibility is no less fascinating. Shared invention suggests that humanity, though scattered, drew from the same well of experience. Everywhere people looked to the sky and saw patterns in stars. Everywhere they watched animals and wove them into myth. Everywhere they buried their dead and pondered the journey beyond life. From these common experiences arose similar symbols, not because they were carried across oceans, but because the human mind is wired to seek meaning in the same ways. Independent invention does not diminish the wonder of Göbekli Tepe or other sites. On the contrary, it magnifies them. It shows that human imagination is powerful enough to reinvent meaning again and again, that symbols of vultures, serpents, and lions emerge naturally in cultures divided by oceans because they speak to universal truths. The convergence of symbols may be less about lost civilizations and more about the shared inheritance of being human. The truth may lie in between. Some ideas may have diffused, carried along ancient trade routes or migrations we have not yet uncovered. Others may have arisen independently. The challenge is to disentangle them, to identify where contact explains similarity and where universality explains convergence. Archaeology, genetics, and linguistics continue to refine our picture, but much remains unknown. What is clear is that Göbekli Tepe forces us to widen our view. Civilization is not a straight line, nor is it a single tree with one root. It may be a forest with many trunks rising from shared soil, each culture inventing anew, sometimes exchanging, sometimes echoing one another across distance and time. The stones on that Anatolian hill may represent one of the earliest blossoms of this forest, but not the only one. And so the carvings of Göbekli Tepe lead us not only backward into prehistory, but outward into the wider question of how humanity creates meaning. Did knowledge survive catastrophe and spread, or did the human spirit simply rise again and again, reinventing the sacred? This is the tension that drives us forward, into the search for lost knowledge, and into the recognition of shared invention. The next step is to see how modern science walks this line. For while myth and speculation speak of lost worlds, archaeologists and geologists dig patiently in soil and seabed, searching for what is real. The question now is, what can science tell us about these mysteries, and how does it navigate the fine line between speculation and truth? The vision of a lost civilization exerts a powerful pull on the imagination. From the time of Plato's tale of Atlantis, people have dreamed of an advanced culture wiped away in catastrophe, leaving behind only fragments. Those who favor diffusion point to monuments as evidence. The pyramids of Egypt and the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica look uncannily similar at first glance. Both rise as massive stone mountains, both aligned to the sky, both serving as sacred centers. Could two cultures on opposite sides of the world have created such forms independently, or do they hint at a shared inheritance? The same question arises with myths. Serpent deities appear in Sumerian, Egyptian, Hindu, and Mesoamerican traditions. Flood stories echo across every continent. Even motifs like twin guardians or sacred mountains recur worldwide. For diffusionists, these parallels are proof that ancient seafarers or survivors of catastrophe spread knowledge far and wide. They argue that the similarities are too many and too precise to dismiss as coincidence. But here lies the caution. Archaeology teaches us that similarity does not always imply contact. Human societies face similar problems and often arrive at similar solutions. Building a pyramid is, in a sense, the simplest way to pile stones high without collapse. It is a natural solution for monument builders across the world. Serpents, vultures, and lions are powerful creatures encountered everywhere, their symbolic weight nearly universal. Floods are among the most common natural disasters, their memory easily transmuted into myth. The repetition of symbols does not require a lost mother culture. It may simply reflect the shared canvas of human existence. Science demands rigor. To prove contact or diffusion, one must find hard evidence, artifacts of trade, genetic traces of migration, inscriptions naming foreign lands, or technologies clearly carried from one culture to another. Without these, parallels remain intriguing but inconclusive. This does not mean they should be ignored, but they must be handled with care. Otherwise, speculation risks overshadowing truth. The danger of pseudoscience is not merely error, but the distortion of history, the replacement of real human achievements with fantasies of forgotten masters. Yet skepticism can also blind us. To dismiss every anomaly as coincidence risks overlooking genuine connections. Ancient peoples were not static. They moved, traded, and exchanged ideas over vast distances. We know obsidian from Anatolia reached the Levant, that shells from the Red Sea found their way into Mesopotamia, that lapis lazuli traveled from Afghanistan to Sumer. If small objects could cross such distances, why not ideas? Why not symbols, myths, or techniques? Perhaps the truth is layered. Some motifs and forms may be independent inventions, born from universal human experience. Others may indeed reflect contact, diffusion, or even memories of older traditions carried through catastrophe. The challenge is to discern which is which, and that requires patience, evidence, and humility. Göbekli Tepe sits at the crossroads of this debate. Its symbols echo those seen elsewhere, yet it stands alone in its time, with no clear predecessors or descendants. Was it an isolated flower of invention, blooming briefly on the Anatolian plateau? Or was it part of a wider tradition now lost to floods and time? The answer remains open, and it is in the search for that answer that science and imagination must walk together. For what is at stake is not only the truth of the past, but the way we tell our own story. Are we the heirs of a single lost civilization, or the children of many cultures rising independently from the same soil? The debate continues, but one thing is certain. The human impulse to create meaning is ancient, powerful, and unending. And so we come to the edge of the question. How do we balance the wonder of speculation with the discipline of science? How do we honor mystery without surrendering to myth? The next step is to see how modern research confronts these questions in the soil, the seas, and the stones, searching for evidence that can tip the balance one way or another. The balance between wonder and discipline is delicate. On one side lies the temptation of myth, to see in every carving and ruin the trace of a forgotten civilization, to weave tales of Atlantis or of travelers crossing oceans 10,000 years ago. On the other side lies the rigidity of skepticism, to dismiss what does not fit the established model, to reduce every anomaly to coincidence or error. Both extremes distort the truth. To find our way, we must walk between them, holding imagination in one hand and evidence in the other. Göbekli Tepe is a perfect example. Its stones are real, its age confirmed by radiocarbon dating. There is no doubt it predates the pyramids by 7 millennia, yet its meaning remains elusive. To claim it as proof of an advanced lost civilization is to go beyond the evidence. To dismiss its sophistication as an accident of primitive hunters is to underestimate its builders. The truth lies in the middle, People without writing, metal, or cities nonetheless created something extraordinary, guided by belief and imagination. They were not primitive, nor were they the heirs of Atlantis. They were us, human beings using the tools of their age to carve visions into stone. The repetition of symbols across cultures remains a mystery, but it is a mystery that does not require fantasy to be profound. If humans everywhere invented vultures as symbols of death, serpents as symbols of rebirth, or pyramids as monuments to eternity, then this speaks to the universality of our minds. It shows that beneath our differences lies a shared way of seeing the world, shaped by sky, earth, and mortality. Independent invention is no less wondrous than diffusion, for it reveals the deep structures of human thought. At the same time, we cannot close the door on contact or on forgotten traditions. Archaeology has often revealed that ancient peoples traveled farther and traded more widely than we once assumed. The obsidian blades of Anatolia, the shells of the Red Sea, the lapis of Afghanistan, all traveled hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Knowledge, too, may have traveled. Symbols may have crossed borders. Ideas may have spread in ways we have not yet traced. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, though it demands caution rather than certainty. What remains undeniable is that the human story is older and more complex than the textbooks once claimed. Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, Çatalhöyük, the flood myths, the underwater ruins all point to a prehistory filled with invention, adaptation, and resilience. Whether through shared invention or fragments of lost knowledge, humanity has always sought to understand its place in the cosmos, to carve meaning into stone and story. The danger of pseudoscience lies not in asking questions, but in pretending to have answers where none exist. The task of science is to keep the questions alive, to test them against evidence, to refine them as discoveries are made. In this way, speculation becomes not a fantasy, but a guide, a lantern held up to the darkness as we search. And so the carvings of Göbekli Tepe and the echoes of symbols across the world leave us with a profound realization. Humanity's first temples and cities were not inevitable results of farming or kingship. They were born of imagination, belief, and the human drive to create meaning. Civilization may not have one root but many, rising again and again from the same soil of human thought. With this understanding, we turn to the stones themselves, to the technology and skill that made Göbekli Tepe possible. For even without metal or wheels, the builders shaped and raised pillars weighing 20 tons, transported them across the hill, and arranged them with precision. How did they do this? What tools, techniques, and knowledge allowed them to carve stone with such mastery? The answer takes us deeper into the dawn of human ingenuity, into a chapter where technology appears far beyond its time. The stones of Göbekli Tepe rise with a quiet defiance against our expectations. Each pillar weighs as much as 20 tons, quarried from limestone and dragged across the hilltop by people who had neither wheels nor beasts of burden. To stand before them is to feel the weight not only of stone, but of mystery. How did a society of hunter-gatherers, armed only with flint tools, accomplish such a feat? The question is not of aliens or miracles, but of human ingenuity. Still, the scale of their achievement feels almost out of time, as though knowledge had surfaced before its moment, only to be buried again. Archaeologists have traced the quarries nearby, where pillars were carved directly from bedrock. Marks on the stone show the use of flint hammers and chisels, simple tools wielded with patience and precision. Cutting limestone with flint is slow, but not impossible. What astonishes is not the method but the will. Hundreds of blows for every groove, days or weeks of labor for each block. The builders committed to work that demanded vision beyond the needs of survival. They were not merely hunters shaping arrowheads. They were artisans shaping monuments to endure. Once carved, the question becomes movement. Without wheels, sledges, or domesticated animals, how were 20-ton stones transported? Experiments suggest that with ropes, wooden rollers, and human strength, such feats are possible. 100 people with coordinated effort could drag a pillar across the plateau. Levers and ramps could raise them upright. None of this requires lost technology, yet the scale of organization is immense. To gather so many, to feed them, to synchronize their labor, implies leadership, planning, and above all, belief. These people were not driven by a ruler's command, but by shared purpose. The carving itself adds another layer. The reliefs of animals are not crude, they are precise, with depth, proportion, and detail. To carve such figures required not only skill but also imagination. It reveals a mind capable of abstraction, of transforming living creatures into symbols on stone. In a world without metal, such artistry stands as a testament to human creativity. It is not that they had tools beyond their time, it is that they used the tools they had with extraordinary mastery. Yet the paradox remains. How could people, without agriculture, without writing, without the hierarchy of kings or priests, create a site so monumental? The answer may lie in the nature of belief itself. Ritual can unite where politics cannot. Shared myth can mobilize labor where armies are absent. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not need wheels or writing to move stone. They needed vision, and that vision was enough. Still, there is a sense of technology beyond time, not in machines but in cognition. The ability to plan, to measure, to carve, and to align suggests mental tools as sophisticated as our own. What they lacked in metallurgy or mathematics, they compensated with memory, oral tradition, and trial and error. In this way, Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly but a mirror, showing us that the capacity for civilization lived within humanity long before the rise of cities. The site forces us to reconsider what technology means. It is not only the wheel, the plow, or the forge, it is the capacity to imagine, to organize, to persist. By this definition, the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed technology enough to move mountains of stone, and in their hands, belief became a tool as powerful as any hammer. But the mystery deepens as we look closer. For even if we can explain the carving, the quarrying, and the transport, the purpose remains elusive. Why build such monuments at all? What compelled people to invest so much labor into a place without homes, without fields, without kings? To answer, we must follow the trail of meaning from stone to story and from technology to legacy. The quarries around Göbekli Tepe reveal as much about the builders as the standing stones themselves. Archaeologists have traced unfinished pillars still attached to bedrock, frozen in the moment of creation, as if the workers had stepped away only yesterday. Some are larger than those erected, suggesting that the builders experimented with size and scale, pushing the limits of what they could carve and move. These quarries show that the site was not built in a single burst but in cycles, with generations shaping stone, raising circles, and then deliberately burying them before beginning anew. Moving stones of 20 tons with no wheels or draft animals may sound impossible, yet experiments in the modern era have shown that it is achievable with determination and coordination. Teams using wooden sledges, levers, and ropes have hauled blocks of similar size across rough terrain. With logs laid as rollers or sledges dragged over prepared paths lubricated with water or clay, people can generate immense force. Raising the pillars upright could be done with earthen ramps and lever systems, gradually tipping the stones into sockets prepared in the ground. What these experiments prove is that the builders of Göbekli Tepe did not require hidden technologies or lost machines. What they needed was cooperation, ingenuity, and an unwavering sense of purpose. But explaining how the stones were moved does not diminish the mystery. If anything, it sharpens it. To organize hundreds of people for weeks or months, to feed them, to coordinate their work, required a social structure more complex than small bands of hunter-gatherers. Yet there is no evidence of palaces or kings, no signs of rulers commanding labor. The motivation must have been spiritual rather than political. Belief itself was the technology that bound them together. Belief that infused stone with meaning. Belief that transformed labor into devotion. The carvings show that their technology extended beyond muscle and stone. Their minds were attuned to geometry and pattern. The circles of pillars are arranged with deliberate precision. Some scholars suggest alignments with stars or solstices, though the evidence is debated. Even without exact astronomy, the builders displayed a sense of spatial order, of design carried in memory, and perhaps in oral tradition. This is architecture without blueprints, yet it achieves balance and symmetry. Such planning requires mental tools every bit as powerful as compasses and rulers. What we see in Göbekli Tepe is not technology out of place, but human ingenuity fully realized with the materials at hand. Flint chisels may seem primitive beside iron, yet in skilled hands they could carve detailed reliefs into limestone. Wooden sledges may seem crude beside wheels, yet they could drag massive pillars across the plateau. Oral tradition may seem fragile beside writing, yet it could preserve the memory of myths and measurements across generations. The true wonder is not lost machines, but the human capacity to innovate with whatever is available. This challenges our view of progress as a ladder climbing steadily upward. In reality, knowledge appears in bursts, shaped by circumstance. The builders of Göbekli Tepe reveal that the mental capacity for architecture, art, and organized labor existed long before the technologies we associate with civilization. Human imagination was ready. Only the tools and context shifted over time. And so the paradox is resolved not by invoking forgotten machines, but by recognizing the depth of human potential. Technology beyond time does not mean metal or wheels before their day. It means that the power of human thought, our true technology, was already ancient, waiting to be expressed. But this leads to the final question. If belief could mobilize such monumental effort, if imagination could carve such enduring symbols, why was Göbekli Tepe buried? Why was it sealed away, its circles entombed beneath layers of rubble, as if hidden for the future? The answer may reveal more than we expect about the builders, their world, and the cycles of civilization itself. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may be the most mysterious act of all. After quarrying, carving, and raising pillars that towered above the plain, after investing generations of labor into circles of stone alive with meaning, the builders chose to fill them in. They buried their temples beneath tons of rubble, sealing them away as though closing a chapter of their world. Archaeologists digging through the fill discovered that it was not the slow work of wind or time. It was deliberate, purposeful, and repeated across multiple enclosures. Why? One possibility is ritual renewal. Each circle may have served for a time, hosting ceremonies, feasts, and gatherings before being respectfully closed and replaced by another. Burial, in this sense, was not abandonment but continuity, a way of layering sacredness into the hill. Another possibility is that beliefs shifted. Perhaps new myths emerged. New symbols took precedence, and the old were no longer needed. Burying the stones would have been a way to honor them while making space for new visions. There is also the chance that practical reasons played a role, that changing climate or dwindling resources made the gatherings unsustainable. Whatever the cause, the burial preserved the site for 12,000 years, a gift to the future that its builders could never have imagined. The paradox of Göbekli Tepe lies in its sophistication amid apparent simplicity. The people had no writing, no metallurgy, no pottery, no wheels. Yet they organized labor on a scale rivaling later civilizations, carved symbols of enduring complexity, and raised monuments that defy the notion of primitive. This disconnect forces us to reconsider the story of progress. Civilization is not a straight path of invention, but a tapestry of experiments, of brilliance that appears, fades, and sometimes vanishes entirely. The builders of Göbekli Tepe remind us that human imagination has always been capable of greatness, even without the trappings of later technology. Their mastery was cognitive rather than mechanical. They measured without rulers, designed without blueprints, recorded without writing. Their technology was the human mind, sharpened by observation, memory, and cooperation. Belief itself functioned as infrastructure, binding people together more effectively than walls or laws. Where we see stone, they saw symbol. Where we see labor, they saw devotion. Where we see enigma, they saw order in a world of change. And yet, the silence after burial is striking. The site lay hidden for thousands of years, its builders forgotten, its myths erased. Only in our time, with shovels and patience, have the stones returned to light. Their re-emergence rewrites the story of civilization. They prove that organized belief, monumental architecture, and symbolic art existed long before the rise of cities, kings, or empires. They show that human ingenuity cannot be measured solely by tools or technologies, but by vision and imagination. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe is not only a wonder of prehistory but a turning point for us. It compels historians to redraw timelines, to acknowledge that the roots of civilization are deeper than once believed. It challenges the boundary between prehistory and history, showing that the dawn of humanity's story stretches farther back than we dared imagine. And so the Hill of Buried Stones speaks to us across 12,000 years. It tells us that technology is not only machines and metals, but the power to dream, to organize, to carve belief into permanence. It whispers that the human mind has always been capable of greatness, and that civilization may have risen and fallen more than once, its traces buried in earth and sea. From this realization, we step into the broader debate that Göbekli Tepe has ignited. What does it mean for our history when the oldest known temple predates the pyramids by 7 millennia? How must textbooks change, and how do archaeologists confront the fine line between evidence and speculation? To answer, we must turn to the rewriting of history itself. When Göbekli Tepe emerged from the earth in the 1990s, it struck the field of archaeology like a thunderbolt. Here was a temple older than any city, a monument older than farming, a site that shattered the neat ladder of human progress taught for generations. The accepted narrative had been clear. First came agriculture, which allowed surplus food. Surplus allowed villages, villages allowed cities, cities allowed temples and monumental architecture. But Göbekli Tepe stood in quiet defiance of this sequence. It was a temple before there were cities, stone circles before there were kings, carvings before there was writing. It was proof that belief had come first, that imagination and ritual had sparked cooperation even before fields of wheat anchored people to the soil. The implications were profound. If temples came before cities, then religion may not have been a byproduct of civilization but its catalyst. If hunter-gatherers could build monumental architecture, then the capacity for complex society was present long before we thought. The site forced textbooks to change, timelines to stretch, and definitions of civilization to blur. Archaeology was no longer a story of linear progress, but of unexpected leaps, of experiments in meaning that predated the empires of Sumer and Egypt by millennia. Yet the rewriting of history is not without resistance. Some scholars hesitate to redraw the map of the past too quickly. They argue that Göbekli Tepe, though extraordinary, may have been an exception, a singular place rather than a widespread pattern. Others caution against overstating its sophistication, reminding us that the builders had no pottery, no writing, no metallurgy. They see Göbekli Tepe as impressive but still transitional, a bridge between nomadic life and settled farming. The debate reflects the tension between caution and wonder, between those who see Göbekli Tepe as a spark and those who see it as a flicker. Outside the halls of academia, the site has ignited fascination and speculation. Fringe theories flourish, linking Göbekli Tepe to Atlantis, to lost civilizations, even to extraterrestrial visitors. The pillars become maps of the stars, the carvings records of cataclysms, the site itself a remnant of an advanced culture erased by flood. Such theories capture imagination, but risk overshadowing the achievements of the real builders. To attribute their work to lost masters or aliens is to deny their ingenuity, to strip them of their humanity. The stones are remarkable enough without invention. They show us that ordinary humans, with flint tools and vision, could carve eternity into stone. The challenge is to walk the fine line between science and speculation. Archaeology must remain rooted in evidence, yet it must also remain open to possibility. Göbekli Tepe teaches us that the past can surprise us, that what seems impossible may simply be undiscovered. It reminds us that humility is as important as skepticism, that our models of history are always provisional, always vulnerable to being rewritten by the next excavation. And in this rewriting, we glimpse something profound. Civilization is not the story of kings and empires alone. It is the story of imagination, of belief, of people gathering to carve meaning into the world. The first monuments were not raised for rulers, but for ritual. The first architecture was not for palaces, but for the sacred. The first city was not of walls and markets, but of circles of stone, where people sought to connect with forces greater than themselves. Göbekli Tepe forces us to remember that the human story did not begin with Sumer or Egypt. It began long before, in places now half buried and half forgotten. The rewriting of history is not a correction of detail. It is a revelation that our roots run deeper, that the dawn of civilization lies in a time when people still hunted and gathered, yet dreamed in stone. And so the stones on that Anatolian hill are not only relics, they are signposts. They remind us that history is not fixed but living, always subject to discovery, always ready to be rewritten. The next question is what this rewriting means for us today. What does it say about who we are and who we might yet become? The debates that swirl around Göbekli Tepe are as monumental as the stones themselves. In lecture halls, journals, and conferences, archaeologists wrestle with what it means to accept a temple before farming, carvings before cities. For many, the site has been a humbling reminder that the human past is far more intricate than the neat timelines of textbooks once suggested. It has forced scholars to concede that their frameworks are provisional, not final truths. The story of civilization is not a ladder but a mosaic, with unexpected pieces appearing in places no one thought to look. Some researchers have embraced the challenge. They propose that ritual was the glue that allowed hunter-gatherers to cooperate on scales larger than family or clan. The shared act of building circles of stone, of carving symbols into pillars, created a sense of belonging that predated agriculture. From ritual gatherings may have sprung the desire to settle permanently, to cultivate food not only for survival, but to feed the masses who came to celebrate the sacred. In this view, Göbekli Tepe did not merely precede farming, it may have sparked it. The need to sustain ritual could have driven people to domesticate plants and animals, reversing the order long assumed. Others urge restraint. They caution that while the site is extraordinary, it may not represent a global revolution. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was unique, a cultural experiment that flourished for centuries and then was abandoned. Other regions show different paths, with farming and village life emerging without temples of stone. To elevate Göbekli Tepe as the key to all civilization risks exaggeration. Archaeology thrives not on single sites but on patterns, and patterns take time to emerge. Beyond academia, the site has become a lightning rod for speculation. Fringe theorists point to its age and sophistication as evidence of lost civilizations, survivors of global cataclysms, or remnants of mythic lands like Atlantis. They see in the carvings records of comet strikes, maps of constellations, or warnings left for future generations. Some claim the site could not have been built by ordinary humans with simple tools, and thus must be the work of outsiders, even beings from beyond the earth. Such theories capture public imagination because they speak to a longing for mystery, for the idea that history holds secrets greater than we are told. But they also risk obscuring the true wonder. To suggest aliens or forgotten empires denies the ingenuity of the builders themselves. It strips them of their achievement and replaces it with fantasy. The stones are magnificent precisely because they were carved by humans like us, with flint and faith, with no aid but their own minds and hands. Mainstream scholars push back against these speculations, not out of fear, but out of commitment to evidence. Archaeology depends on what can be dug, dated, measured, and tested. Myths may inspire questions, but answers must rest on what the soil reveals. Still, even scientists acknowledge that Göbekli Tepe opens doors to questions once dismissed. If temples came before farming, what else might have preceded what we assume? If a site of this magnitude could lie buried until the 20th century, what others may remain hidden beneath soil or sea? The clash between mainstream caution and fringe enthusiasm reflects more than a battle over facts. It reveals a tension at the heart of how we tell our story. Do we see history as the slow, steady climb of progress, or as a series of forgotten experiments, some lost, some remembered? Do we honor mystery as fuel for science, or surrender it to speculation? The rewriting of history requires not only new discoveries but also new humility, a willingness to admit that the story of humanity is far from complete. Göbekli Tepe is not a footnote. It is a chapter torn from the earth that changes the book. It shows us that civilization's roots lie deeper than we thought, and that the seeds of imagination and ritual were present long before the empires of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus. It reminds us that our ancestors were capable of wonders long before the markers of modernity appeared. As the debate continues, one truth stands firm. The stones of Göbekli Tepe are real. They stand silent but eloquent, older than the pyramids, older than writing, carved by hands that knew neither kings nor machines. Whatever else we argue, the stones remain, rewriting history one excavation at a time. But this rewriting leads naturally to the next question. If our story is deeper and stranger than we believed, what does that mean for us today? What legacy does the first civilization leave, and how does it shape the way we see ourselves in the present? The rewriting of history does not end with archaeologists debating dates or theories in quiet rooms. It touches the way we see ourselves. For centuries, the story of humanity was told as a steady ascent, from caves to villages, from villages to cities, from cities to empires. Progress was imagined as inevitable, a ladder climbing upward without interruption. But Göbekli Tepe tears that ladder apart. It shows that brilliance appeared early, that imagination and organization were present long before cities, and that civilization is not a single line but a mosaic of experiments, some remembered, many forgotten. This realization carries a weight of humility. It reminds us that the people of 12,000 years ago were not primitive in mind, only different in tools. Their visions were as vast as ours, their capacity for meaning as profound. To dismiss them as simple hunters is to blind ourselves to the truth of our shared humanity. They carved belief into stone with the same intensity that later peoples carved laws into tablets or stories into papyrus. They were, in every sense, our equals in imagination. Yet humility is paired with caution. To rewrite history does not mean surrendering to myth. The temptation is great to see in every anomaly proof of lost civilizations, to fold Göbekli Tepe into tales of Atlantis or cosmic visitors. Such stories may inspire, but they can also mislead. They risk obscuring the real wonder, that humans, without aid from gods or outsiders, achieved something extraordinary. The truth needs no embellishment. The stones themselves are miracle enough. The fine line between science and speculation is where the future of archaeology must walk. Scientists must keep imagination alive, for it fuels discovery, but they must anchor it always in evidence. Speculation is a lantern, but evidence is the ground it must light. Göbekli Tepe shows us that surprises await, that we cannot be complacent, that history is still being written in soil and stone. It warns us against arrogance, against believing the story is complete. Every dig has the potential to change the narrative again, and so we stand between two truths. On one side, Göbekli Tepe shatters the old model, rewriting history in stone. On the other, it teaches us caution, to resist the pull of fantasy, and instead let evidence guide wonder. In this balance, we find the true legacy of the site. It is not only a monument of the past, but a lesson for the present, that knowledge must be sought with both imagination and humility. From here, the story turns to us. What does this rewriting mean for our place in the world today? What legacy do the first builders leave us, 10,000 years before the pyramids? To answer, we must look not only at the stones but at ourselves, and see what humanity's first civilization still whispers to those willing to listen. The story that began in stone circles on a hill in Anatolia is not only about the past, it is about us. Göbekli Tepe and the ruins like it are not frozen relics to be admired from a distance. They are mirrors reflecting back truths about what it means to be human, truths that have endured across 12,000 years. The builders are gone, their names forgotten, their language lost, their myths erased. Yet their vision remains, carved into limestone pillars that still catch the light of the rising Sunday. The first lesson they leave us is humility. Civilization is not as young as we thought. It did not appear suddenly in the fertile valleys of Sumer or along the Nile. Its roots sink deeper, into a time when people still hunted gazelle and gathered wild grain, when life was precarious yet filled with meaning. To see monumental architecture born in such a world reminds us that imagination is older than kingship, that belief is older than writing, and that humanity's greatness does not depend solely on tools or technology, but on vision and cooperation. The second lesson is continuity. The symbols carved into the stones, vultures, serpents, lions, foxes, are still with us, carried in myths and stories across continents. The human mind, it seems, has always sought to explain life and death, to map the heavens, to connect with forces beyond the self. Our myths may change their names, our gods may shift their faces, but the impulse is the same. We inherit from Göbekli Tepe not only a monument of stone, but a way of seeing, a way of making sense of the cosmos. The third lesson is fragility. Göbekli Tepe was built, used, and then buried. Its people vanished, their rituals silenced, their city of stone sealed away. Civilization is not inevitable. It is fragile, subject to climate, to catastrophe, to the choices of those who live it. If entire worlds could vanish 12,000 years ago, what does that say about our own? The site is both a triumph and a warning. It shows what humans can achieve, but also how easily those achievements can be lost. Standing at the threshold of the modern age, we find ourselves looking back at the first age, and the connection is unbroken. The stones of Göbekli Tepe whisper across millennia, telling us that we are not the first to dream, not the first to carve symbols into permanence, not the first to imagine eternity. They remind us that we belong to a long continuum, that the line between past and present is thinner than we think. 10,000 years before the pyramids, people gathered to shape stone into meaning. They carved vultures to speak of death, serpents to speak of rebirth, foxes to speak of cunning. They lifted pillars toward the sky as though reaching for the stars. They left no writing, but their stones are a script, their carvings a message, their hill a monument to the dawn of imagination. And now, uncovered after millennia of silence, they leave us with a question. Who are we, if those we called primitive were already so capable, so creative, so human? The answer lies not only in the stones, but in ourselves. We are the heirs of Göbekli Tepe, inheritors of a legacy written in rock. Their story is our story, their vision our vision, their questions our questions. The final legacy of the first civilization is this, that we are older, deeper, and more mysterious than we knew. The past is not gone. It lives in us, in the myths we still tell, in the symbols we still carve, in the skies we still watch. 10,000 years before the pyramids, humanity looked at the stars and shaped stone to mirror them. They left us questions written in rock, waiting for us to remember who we truly are. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe does not linger only in its stones. It lingers in us, in the persistence of symbols and stories that echo across cultures and centuries. The vulture carved into a pillar 12 millennia ago finds its shadow in the Egyptian goddess, who spread her wings across temple walls. The serpent coiled in relief on the Anatolian hill slithers forward into the feathered serpent of Mesoamerica, into the dragons of China, into the Ouroboros swallowing its own tail in the myths of Greece. The lion, carved with power into the stone, prowls into the guardian statues of Mesopotamia, into the heraldic beasts of medieval Europe, into the flags and emblems of nations today. These continuities are not coincidences. They are reminders that the human mind turns again and again to the same images when grappling with the mysteries of existence. Symbols are resilient because they arise from universal experiences: death, birth, danger, renewal, the turning of the sky, the rising of the sun, all are constants in the human condition. Across time and geography, people have reached for images that could carry these truths into story. The persistence of such symbols shows that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not distant strangers but kin, thinking and feeling as we do, searching for permanence in a world of change. Their carvings are not relics of an alien mindset, but the beginnings of a shared human language that still shapes our art, religion, and imagination. This continuity forces us to reconsider the boundary between past and present. Too often, prehistory is imagined as a gulf separating us from primitive ancestors. But the stones tell another story. They show that 12,000 years ago, humans already asked the same questions we ask today. Where did we come from? What lies beyond death? What do the stars mean? The answers may differ, but the questions endure. The builders of Göbekli Tepe stand beside us in that search, not behind us. The site also illuminates the role of myth in human survival. Myths are not idle stories. They bind communities, give shape to the unknown, and motivate collective action. Without kings, armies, or laws, the builders raised circles of stone through shared belief. In doing so, they reveal a truth that still governs us. Societies are held together not only by technology or politics, but by stories. The myths we tell ourselves shape the worlds we build. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe is less a monument to the past than a mirror of the present. We too carve our beliefs into stone and steel, into skyscrapers and monuments, into flags and institutions. The tools change, but the impulse is the same. As we face our own uncertainties, climate change, shifting societies, the vast unknowns of space exploration, the legacy of Göbekli Tepe becomes more than historical curiosity. It is a reminder that humanity has always confronted uncertainty with imagination. We have always turned to symbols and stories to guide us through chaos. We have always built together when belief gave us a reason. If our ancestors could carve eternity into limestone with flint tools, what might we achieve with the tools of today? The legacy of the first civilization is not that it was lost, but that it lives on. It breathes in the myths we still tell, in the stars we still map, in the monuments we still raise. The people who gathered on that Anatolian hill left us more than stones. They left us a way of being human, one that endures across the ages. And so, as we stand in the shadow of their pillars, we are reminded that we are part of the same story. Civilization is not a chain of inventions alone. It is a chain of meaning, passed from hand to hand, from stone to stone, from age to age. Göbekli Tepe is the first link we have uncovered, but it will not be the last. Beneath the earth and beneath the seas, more chapters may yet wait. The stones of Göbekli Tepe call us to listen, to remember, to recognize that our story is far older and far deeper than we once believed. Their legacy is not only what they built, but what they left for us to build upon. The hill of Göbekli Tepe, now stripped of its earth and silence, stands as both beginning and reminder. It is the beginning of monumental architecture, the first known place where humans carved belief into permanence. And it is a reminder that our story does not unfold in straight lines, but in circles, like the stone enclosures themselves, repeating patterns of rise and fall, of discovery and loss. Imagine those circles alive once more. Fires lit against the night, chants echoing against the pillars, symbols flickering in torchlight as if alive. People gathered not for survival alone, but for meaning, for connection, for the promise that the world could be understood. Now imagine us, 12 millennia later, standing on the same hill, gazing not at fires but at stars through telescopes, not at carved foxes but at data etched in code. The tools have changed, but the impulse is the same. We are still seekers, still builders, still dreamers, carving meaning into the unknown. The legacy of the first civilization is not frozen in the past. It flows through us, shaping the myths we inherit, the symbols we repeat, the monuments we raise. 10,000 years before the pyramids, people lifted stones toward the sky. Today, we lift rockets and satellites, machines of metal and fire, toward the same heavens. Both acts are born of the same desire, to connect earth and sky, mortal and eternal, human and cosmic. Their buried stones whisper that progress is not guaranteed, that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge can be lost as easily as it is gained. Yet they also remind us that imagination endures, that even in times of fragility, humans create wonders, that meaning is as necessary as bread. This is their gift. Not only the stones themselves, but the truth they carry that humanity has always been greater than its tools and always capable of more than it believes. So we end where we began, with the question, who built Göbekli Tepe and why? The answer is both simple and profound. It was built by humans, people no different from us in mind or spirit, driven by the same longing for meaning. They built it because they could not do otherwise, because to be human is to carve belief into the world, to leave behind marks that say, we were here and we dreamed. 10,000 years before the pyramids, humans shaped stone to mirror the stars. They left us questions written in rock, waiting for us to remember who we truly are. And as we walk among their pillars, we carry their legacy forward, for the story they began is still unfolding, and we are its next chapter.